Trollops and Wantons, a short story. A house painter visits an ageing professor. Background. In the age of gimmicks, the local university at Bendigo, Australia, installed a 20-foot tall statue of Marilyn Monroe in the city's Central Park. Winging years curtail a plain man's anticipation, and yesterday seems more and more like a cosy dream. Poor greasy Miller, the house painter, certainly had the nostalgics. He was seated at the corner of Mitchell and Queen and gazing aloft at where the Greenwood Hotel once had been. Standing there now, charcoal in its modernity, grim with steel uprights, was a thin-windowed eyesore, 3 stories in dimension and as bleak as science fiction. After saying good morning and confessing that his wife June was trying on dresses which might very well waylay him several hours, he lamented not only the dusty demise of the Greenwood, which he and several apprentices had once painted a crisp ochre with mission brown trims back in 1957, but olden architecture in general, and he expressed in colourful terms his disdain for new buildings and, while he was at it, new paints. "It's all these damned acrylics," he moaned. In the old and thus better days, real house paints were based on catalysts of lead. I expressed a little surprise at his preference, and he admitted that many in the trade warmed to water-based thinners, but he, as in most things, was what he termed old school, and he pined for the scent of truly toxic paints he had known and loved in his younger days. He was a somewhat chubby blubber, but jolly for that, with rich sideburns compensating for his sad attempt at a comb-over. His blue-veined nose testified to his gentle and enduring admiration for a double malt whisky. I agreed, however, about the new building. "Ugly," I said. "Hideous," said he, and he observed that this monstrosity, where the charming alehouse had once stood, was among many going up all around the district. Even more so, he found the morning ripe for deeper reminiscences, and complained about the general condition of contemporary sociology, what with the new fashion of dagging around with your trousers hanging near your knees, and girls getting around in multicoloured dye jobs. He really didn't know what the world was coming to. In this context, he found the occasion to relate to me a recent adventure he had known in local history, and was himself somewhat surprised I knew little about it. "I expect you know all about Professor Bogstein," he said, being the narrator and all. I assured him, in keeping with the morning's theme, that authorial omniscience wasn't all it had once been, and that my understanding of this particular character in short rural fiction was rather sketchy. I knew he lived out near Beryl's Crossing, and had done so for many years, and estimated that he must, by now, be getting long of tooth. 85 years next spring, said Greasy, slowing down a bit, but he'll probably outlive both of us, I reckon. The secret to such longevity, he opined, was keeping sharp of mind, and with this I was inclined to agree yet again. In the case of Professor Bogstein, he then reported, there was prodigious mental application. The old fellow was immersed in his mode of research, and would no doubt be dedicated to higher learning until the day he died, which was altogether commendable. Regrettably, though, there was a wider tale of academic decline to tell. "I don't know if you're aware of it," said Greasy, "but the professor was telling me about how academia has really gone to the dogs." "I would not be taken aback to hear it," I said, and we both agreed that if urban architecture and street fashions had fallen into decadence, then no doubt the hallowed halls of universities and colleges were probably equally as dodgy these days. Indeed, we agreed that much of the rot could probably be traced there, in fact. "You betcha," said Greasy. "Terrible." And he shook his house painter's head. He then complained, noticing that June was nowhere to be seen and was unlikely to emerge from Target any time within the hour, that he had of recent times been tinkering in the second-hand stores in restless pleasure, this being one of his preoccupations, which I knew, and one day, amongst much flotsam and piffle, he found, or it did so catch his eye, a lovely ivory locket that he deemed exceedingly olden. A beautiful thing, he said, yellowed with time's steady drawl, and he described it as a keepsake that was quite possibly a worthy antique. The second-hand dealer had obviously overlooked it, and it was sitting unbidden in a box of knickknacks going for a song. He therefore provided the dealer with such a song, and taking home the locket, intrigued by its Victorian elegance, firstly, and secondly, hoping that it might fetch him a tidy profit on the resale. "You never know," he said, looking at me in earnest. "Some of these things can be worth a fortune." "Indeed," said I, and I appreciated that Greasy, as well as painting houses, peddled odds and ends on the side. To ascertain the value of the bauble, though, requires assiduity, and something more than a bum's guess at the relics of history. He was accordingly apprised, in an amateur way, of much local lore, and also expert in tracing back the lineage of various bits and pieces. If he bought a cypress dresser for $20 at a garage sale, he might trace its maker to a workshop in Gnostic Leap that had prospered in the 1930s before the Great Depression got everyone depressed. Providence is a shiny narrative after all. If you know the story that goes with something, he remarked, you can usually add an extra £5 or so to the asking price. It seemed to me a sound philosophy. And, as he explained, the story travelling with this ivory locket might well enrich its merit because, he said, there was an inscription on the underside, along with a lady's picture, and it resounded with quite juicy possibilities. He rambled off upon some loose red herrings first, but eventually reached his account. It said, he said, by which he meant the aforementioned inscription on the backing, "To my darling Jane, with sweet affection forever." Accompanying this was a sepia smiley of what he reasonably took to be this Jane, this being, however, not some staid and primly dainty woman of a bygone age in all its boredom, but instead a wild-headed beauty beholden in her corset and her bloomers. "Well," said Greasy, and he let that information hang about, and we both idly eyed the passing traffic of the street corner, thinking about social decay, and noticed that June, Mrs. Greasy, was still nowhere to be noticed. To be honest, I was looking for an opening to ask him how much he might charge me to slap on a new coat of whitewash on my veranda overhang, which was looking rugged, but he was determined to tell me the story of the locket. I reasoned, not unreasonably moreover, that the story would lead us to Professor Bogstein and the perilous state of the academy, and indeed, in due course it did. "I managed to determine," said Greasy eventually, citing a chain of transmission through a friend of a cousin, "that this Jane woman in her bloomers was a woman named Jane O'Connell, and once he had established this, he had been directed to Beryl's Crossing and the expertise of our professor." "I see," I said. "But I guess, as the narrator, you know all this already," he said. "Not at all," I said. "Please go on." He did. So he had a locket with inscription and sepia smiley, and he had directions to the abode of Professor Bogstein. He rang ahead and received a cordial invitation. Beryl's Crossing is, of course, a small town, and had once been promoted as a haven for retirees. Strangely, it had fostered a slightly literary culture and was the home to several poets, journal writers and authors of not uninteresting non-fiction. For a small town, therefore, it could boast a robust intellectual culture, though mainly of geriatrics, and so it was not entirely out of place that one might find there an academic of the standing of old Professor Bogstein. He lived there with his wife, Edith, a small, softly spoken lady in a double-fronted Edwardian affair with wrought iron trimmings, the whole of it well painted, Greasy said, in a tasteful heritage colour scheme. He turned up. It was a Saturday morning, and the old couple greeted him in the garden, where they tended a splendid array of heritage roses and trumpet-headed daffodils. "Mr. Miller," enjoined the professor. He was an advocate of such formalities, which is to say he was even more old school than Greasy. Greasy might say, "Please, call me Greasy," but it was not to be. Even though a Saturday morning, and even though long retired, the professor was abound in a shirt and tie and still wearing his professional attire with patches on his suit coat elbows and nothing casual about his shoes. Quite properly, he introduced his wife and made a pleasant speech regarding the fine state of the weather, and only then suggested that they retire inside for conversation and a cup of tea. "You should have seen it," Greasy said to me. "Inside, books from floor to ceiling." Over many decades, the professor had accrued a massive library dedicated to his field of expertise, and he and Edith lived there immersed in a musty avalanche of erudite tomes that quite clearly were thumbed and rummaged with loving application. Greasy wanted to underline this to me. "I mean, this guy is a real scholar," he said. "Books, papers, encyclopedias, all the paraphernalia of learning." Greasy, in fact, had noticed that there were degrees and citations and awards hanging framed about the walls. This was a gentleman of decorated achievements. This was not some smart-aleck, unkempt bumfluff such as taught creative writing at the Lower Murrumbidgee School of Further Education. No, this was a genuine world-class egghead with a slab of letters after his name to prove it. Respect. Greasy, therefore, knew that he was in the right company. If anyone could tell him the history of his locket and the true tale of Jane O'Connell, it would be the good professor. In due course, therefore, he broached the subject, and sure enough, the professor could relate. They sat in the study. Edith came and went, bringing tea and ginger-nut crumbles. She was not uninformed herself. She was clearly a woman of some nous, and showed herself well versed in the professor's undertakings, not merely as a wife of 60 years, but as an assistant, a collaborator, a partner in adventures of the mind. She took an interest in the locket and quickly shuffled off into another room before returning with several books that she knew would be relevant to the case. "Ah, yes," said the professor at length. "Ah, yes." He looked up. Greasy was expectant. "Jane O'Connell. Yes. Midnight Jane." "Midnight Jane?" "Midnight Jane O'Connell," said the professor fully. "Notorious around these districts, approximately 1873 through to about mid-1890s, I believe." "Notorious?" "Oh, yes, quite." The professor took out a large lunar magnifier from his desk drawer and looked closely at the bauble, and especially at the inscription. He muffled to himself inwards, hummed, and took on the studied appearance of bookish recognitions. Then he said, "Yes, yes," several more times. He would then relate that Midnight Jane, as her name implied, and as did befit her bloomers and shock of wild hair, was a euphemistic lady of the night, serving Cornish miners and the wool workers who made the wharves a rowdy place in that distant but romantic age. The narrative that revealed itself within his inquiring fingers was a familiar one. "Some poor fellow," explained the professor, "has fallen for a hook, line and sinker, and very likely she has milked him for a fortune, if he had one. And this locket is a melancholy memento of a tryst that probably left him ruined like 1,000 others." Greasy sat fascinated. "Really?" he said. The professor, who was obviously deeply read in every in and out about it, explained the source of the notoriety. Cornish miners and wool workers, he explained, were a bunch of sorry chumps, and Midnight Jane, as the sepia Smiley did reveal, was quite a looker in her younger days. She cleaned up along the river towns and made a tidy sum. Many men had tried to take her hand, but in every case her looks and rambling ways prevailed. She was called Midnight because she started work in the bars and boozers in Elegant Ridge when it was well past 11, and when, by that time, the clientele was duly primed on ethanol and other modes of moonshine. "So the keepsake," said Greasy, understanding, "is likely a record of love unrequited." "Oh, dear me, yes," said the Professor, smiling. "You can be sure of it," chipped in Edith, bringing in the milk. Which settled that. The mystery was undone. There would be no telling which particular chump it was, but the gentleman who had purchased the locket had no doubt blown his money. Was it worth anything? The Professor could not offer an opinion on the value of antiques, of course, but he thought that local collectors might pay a small but sturdy recompense for a genuine midnight Jane O'Connell blow-off, especially since it portrayed her in her knickers. This, even so, was all news to Greasy. "Well," he said, "I had no idea." The Professor thereupon took this as an invitation. Boffins, old and young, relished a chance to discourse upon their esoterica over morning tea. Professor Bogstein, even 85 next spring, was not going to be an exception. "Indeed so," he chimed. Then he opened up. The riverlands and mining towns had an extensive history of raucous habits. Restless pleasure had not been called restless pleasure for nothing. There was Midnight Jane, and then there was the famous German beauty, Emerald Fist, the blushin' Prussian, Hanny Ovaltine, sumptuous and prolific, and Crumpet Nell, to say nothing of the sultry Angela Derwent May, and the aptly appellationed Mary Lovelong, who, it said, killed 100 healthy men through sheer endurance. Then there was Miss Caroline Gruntworthy, similarly apportioned, and Zelda Spruce, and Betty the three-stage rocket. The old Professor could and would discourse upon them all. His wife would remind him too not to forget Lady Billingsgate of Guildford, who in the years of Federation romanced magnates and millionaires, collected over a dozen husbands, and was fondly wined and dined by governors and prime ministers for the lick of her tardy reputation. A trooper. Greasy took back his locket, and the Professor, requiring no further encouragement, held forth on sundry others, and all the history of every one, and the very particulars of a trade that had once shaped the rustic fibres of the burgeoning land. There was the case of Nagasaki Nancy, he explained, for example, who wowed the English wayfarer with her oriental charms. And then, having mentioned the Orient, he could not neglect to recount the extraordinary skills of Ping Pong Marie. By this time, Greasy felt overwhelmed with learning. He realised just how little he knew. The Professor spoke in layman's terms, but even so the visitor was but a house painter after all. He looked around. He tried to read the sideways gilding on the many volumes, but his natural instincts were to note that the cornices needed painting afresh. He tried to think of things to ask to make himself not seem such a simple oink in the academic presence, a tradesman confronting a brainy outlook. All he could manage, though, was to look wide-eyed and utter, "Well, you certainly know your stuff, Professor." And indeed he did, nor was he entirely modest about it. "Well, I've devoted half a century to studying the Trollops and Wantons of the river districts," he admitted. Alert and replete, he nevertheless looked creaky and worn by his total dedication. His eyes were milky as becomes the aged. His hands were not as steady as they might have been years before, it was true, but a lifetime of study had not wearied him. Others might find it a dry undertaking, but somebody had to do it, he said. "I see," said Greasy. "Did you know that?" Greasy asked me. "Professor Bogstein's field of expertise is loose women of the riverlands." I confessed I did not. "No," said Greasy, pausing. "Neither did I. He's written a dozen books on the subject. He wrote his PhD on Zoe Zuma, the human hoover, who could suck golf balls through a garden hose." "Is that right?" "Yes. I'd say he has a profound grasp on the topic." "One wonders," said I, "how a man settles upon these particular fields of study, doesn't one?" "Well, that's what I wondered for sure," said Greasy. Anyway, he was about to get to the point, namely the sorry plight of academe, since Mrs. Greasy was clearly not about to come back from her shopping. The locket was settled business. It was probably worth about $30. The Professor at that juncture had then bewailed the unfashionable tenor of his credence. It happened that, even having acquired such a vast store of important research, and having weathered the era quite well, and having remained entirely resolute in his standards, staying old school, that alas, the old school itself had slipped away, and the professor himself that morning retired into his own bitter dose of the nostalgics, just as had we, on the corner of Mitchell and Queen. He was scintillated to be discoursing to a novice, and had such a deep commitment to the integrity of his erudition. But when he paused, and Edith came in offering them a plate of her melting moments, he sighed because it finally reoccurred to him that, after all, few students and even fewer administrators could be bothered with his insights and his passions, and he was among the last of a dying breed. "Ah, dear," he uttered under his breath, turning. "Of course, nowadays," he said, forlorn, "it's all urban planning and economics. No one wants to study bimbos anymore." "No?" said Greasy, saddened. "I'm afraid not," said the professor. He related how his own discipline had incongruously been swallowed up by so-called queer studies, a rancid blancmange of resentment and butch haircuts. In the years before his retirement, he had found himself enduring the great indignity of working among a new cadre of young professors who viewed his floozy studies as quaint and plumb passé. So much for classical learning. "Did you know that?" Greasy asked me. "No one wants to study bimbos anymore." Once more I confessed I did not, but I did say I was not surprised. "Young people," I said, "they don't know what they don't know." "Too true," saith the Greasy. "Too true." Even worse, the professor had related that, in the current climate, one could not even secure a decent research grant to investigate the habits of fancy ladies in the 1890s if one tried. Back in his day, the Commonwealth was throwing money at the problem. Now, nothing. Most of the peer-reviewed journals, the Australian Journal of Historical Strumpets, the Australasian Tootsie Review, Garters and Gutters, Southern Toddy, had closed down into blank extinction. The stream of eager undergrads had dried up to a trickle. It was a tragic eventuality, and it made him wonder about the prospects of the coming generation. "I know how you feel, Professor," said Greasy. "Even in my field, apprentices these days, they hardly know how to handle a paintbrush. It's all rollers and spray guns to them." It was good to compare notes with a man who understood the erosion of the basics. "Students these days," scoffed the professor, "they wouldn't know the difference between a doxy and a broad." "You can say that again," said Greasy, wholeheartedly. "Universities," said the professor. "They've all succumbed to fads from overseas." He pointed out that the local institution had just recently funded an exhibition featuring a 20-foot-tall statue of Marilyn Monroe and gave away bachelor's degrees to those who crawled underneath to peer up her skirt. "I saw that in the newspapers," said Greasy. "Yes." The professor assured him that many ladies native to the river towns, whom he had studied and documented in copiously detailed and cross-referenced carnality, could in their time have made Marilyn Monroe look like a Girl Scout, and the habit of universities of importing talentless bints from America to study just drove him to despair. "I quite understand," said Greasy. "I do." The professor was grim. Edith, standing there, said that Teddy, she called the professor by his first name, had argued unsuccessfully for years that local fornicators outclassed the foreign ones by a country mile. "Another cup of tea, Mr. Miller?" she asked Greasy, holding up the teapot. He said he might, because the company was salubrious and it was good, for a change, to be among decent people who could see the standards of society going to rack and ruin. "So you see," said Greasy, turning to me, "things are pretty crook in academia too, and the general public is simply unaware." I told him that I in fact knew someone who had completed their BA by staring up at Marilyn Monroe's minge, and admitted that it didn't seem right to me. Why, I wondered, weren't we teaching our young people about the likes of Midnight Jane instead? Exactly, said Greasy, and for the umpteenth time that morning we were in a nostalgic concord. Yet Professor Bogstein, he related, held out little reprise. Over there in Beryl's Crossing, that small oasis of culture, he continued with his research regardless, and was merely content that he and many of his colleagues had been fortunate enough to have lived in an age when real scholarship was still valued, even if, in the end, they had not been able to prevent the barbarians from overrunning the temple. He is philosophical about it, I suppose, Greasy surmised, for the professor had shrugged his shoulders and believed that one day, perhaps far yonder, the tide will turn again. Greasy had stayed and conversed on the downward spiral of things with the good professor and his wife for several hours that morning, and had learned much about the demise of higher institutions. It brought him some comfort in the way to learn that even in such upper echelons as in his own modest trade, the failing centre of integrity had lost its standing vortex. We should not be surprised, therefore, which was the upshot of the entire conversation, that lovely old alehouses like the Greenwood Hotel had been bulldozed summarily without so much as a regret, and replaced with beastly boxes that disfigure the morning streetscape, nor that youth get about in ridiculous attire as if it is the mark of sophistication. Any society that neglects its heritage of Trollops and Wantons has clearly lost its compass already. A society, as Greasy would say, that paints its hallways and outskirts in no-wash acrylics has already succumbed to modes of artificiality unbecoming. I myself knew full well that I would have found some rapport with the old professor. Being a narrator in a short story these days, I assured Greasy, is increasingly a loose-fitting thing. He looked at me and our eyes met in that nostalgic exchange. It's all this metafiction, I explained. Fictions about fictions about fictions. Our understanding, therefore, was solid, but without having to say so, we both reciprocated a further understanding that, at very least, certain constants never surrender. A good wife, for instance, will still take all morning to try on a dress. There might have been a time when Greasy would have grown impatient and might have reprimanded Mrs. Greasy with words such as, "Damn, woman, do you think I've got all day?" when she finally emerged from the Target sliding doors and seemed as blissfully oblivious to the damage on the clock as to the damage on her credit card. Now, though, it was a source of almost cosmic reassurance. Small things linger in the ebbing noontide, and such things, in fact, form a foundation for cheerfulness even amongst the charcoal grey eyesores of tomorrow. This is what transpired when our eyes met, just for a moment, on the corner of Mitchell and Queen, gaiety transfiguring all that dread. In the end, you shake your house painter's head and treat it all as a giggle and as an excuse for a bolt of double malt. "I was wondering, Greasy," I said, finally, after an appropriate pause, "if you would give me a quote for a new coat of whitewash on my veranda overhang. It's looking a bit rugged." He nodded. Back to business in the present tense. The world can lug its own burdens. It always has and always will. That too will never change. "Sure," he said. "I'll come around later this afternoon."